You have a lot of different senses. You have, vision, smell, taste, touch, hearing, and many other senses, which we'll also mention later. Just to remind you, we talked about this back in the video on the brain. Specific parts of the brain that are, all about sensing certain kinds of things. So you have that primary somatosensory cortex, which is where all of your, bodily sensations are first processed. Close to that, you have the taste area, which senses taste. Close to that, you have, in the temporal lobe, you have the primary auditory cortex. Back at the occipital lobe, you have the primary visual cortex. And then at the very bottom of the frontal lobe, you have the area that's mostly involved in detecting smell. Let's talk about hearing. Hearing is the movement of rhythmic molecules, typically through air. So sound requires molecules. Sound requires some medium through which to move. If there's no molecules, then you can't have vibrations and you can't have hearing as a result. This is why we say in space, no one can hear you scream, because there's nothing in space. So if you've ever watched like a sci-fi movie where they're, shooting lasers in space, it should be totally silent. So pretty much every Star Wars movie you've ever seen is a total lie. So that's all sound is. That's all hearing is just the transduction of these rhythmic vibrations of air molecules. So the way that we describe the things we hear is by talking about them in terms of sound waves. So a sound wave is just a specific kind of rhythmic movement. And we can describe it in terms of two kinds of qualities. It's frequency, so the number of cycles that it completes by the sound wave in 1 second. This is what determines the pitch of the sound, and we measure it in hertz. And then there's amplitude, which is the loudness of the sound, and we measure that in decibels. Now, you can only hear a certain range of various frequencies, and very high-pitched frequencies can actually be painful or even damaging. And the same goes for the decibels. So we can only hear a certain decibel range. What the decibel of 0 is what is the human threshold for hearing. So 0 decibels, that's your human threshold. And then as you get higher and higher, you start to get to things like around decibel level of 20. That's when somebody's like whispering to you from not too far away. About 60, that's normal conversation, kind of like what I'm at right now. So the decibel level I'm at is about 60, assuming you have your speakers tuned properly. Once you start driving in a car, going about 55 miles per hour, like on a freeway or just in a city or something like that, that's 80 decibels. 100, that's when it starts to get, once you get up to 100, now you're standing next to a subway train or next to Niagara Falls or something. That's when it starts to become painful and potentially damaging. Once you get higher than 100, like 120 or 140, you could suffer from permanent damage. So the ear has 3 parts: the outer ear, the middle ear, and the inner ear. The outer ear, that's the part that you can see. It's this part and slightly inside. So if you look inside, you can actually see what's called the tympanic membrane. We just call it the eardrum. But the most visible part, this part, that's the pinna. Now, just behind the eardrum, just behind that tympanic membrane, you have the middle ear. So the middle ear consists of these 3 small bones that vibrate in accordance with the transduction of these molecules that you're detecting. And this middle ear, these bones, are called the malleus, the incus, and the stapes, or sometimes they're just called the hammer, anvil, and stirrup. When you look at the inner ear, you'll see something that looks a bit like a snail. That snail-shaped organ is called the cochlea. And inside the cochlea, inside this spiraling kind of organ, you have a bunch of tiny little hairs. And it's these hair cells that are the receptors for hearing. So it's these hair cells that, if damaged, will result in, most likely, permanent hearing loss. Now, there's a few different theories as to exactly how the cochlea transduces these rhythmic movements of molecules into things that you're hearing. So the two basic theories are the place theories and the frequency theories. So according to the place theories, each little segment along the cochlea, remember it's little spirals, so each little segment along the cochlea is related to a different pitch. So depending on which patch of hair cells is vibrating the most, that will determine what pitch you're hearing. And the frequency theory is completely different. With the frequency theory, now there is no difference between which parts are vibrating. Now all we're looking at is how much do they vibrate. So the faster they vibrate, the higher the frequency. So if you do have some damage to your hair cells, it's probably going to be a pretty serious issue. But just because you're suffering hearing loss, that doesn't mean you have damaged or destroyed hair cells. You could have what's called conductive hearing loss, which is the result of simply having a poor transfer of these vibrations from the tympanic membrane to the inner ear. So there's something going on in your middle ear that's preventing that vibration from easily getting through. Now you can compensate for this. This is a relatively minor issue. You could compensate for this by using a hearing aid. So it's something you could just put on top of your ear to amplify the sounds. Or you could have people shout at you instead. But if you do have damage to your hair cells, if you do have that kind of permanent hearing loss, it's not like there's nothing you can do. You can what the hearing loss you're experiencing is called sensory neural hearing loss, and you can compensate for that by getting what's called a cochlear implant. And that's exactly what it sounds like. It's an implant that goes into the cochlea. So you have, in some sense, you have like an artificial cochlea. You have an electronic device that will directly stimulate your auditory nerves. Now, besides being very effective, and besides being able to give people hearing that either never had a functioning cochlea or had lost their hearing, besides being such a great piece of technology that's really helped a lot of people, cochlear implants are also pretty cool, because if you do get one, you will literally classify as a cyborg. The best thing you can do, the best word of advice I have for you, is to just try to avoid the whole situation. Take care of your hair cells. Keep in mind that these things, these little tiny hair cells, are what you need to protect whenever there's loud sounds in the environment. So just if you ever go to work at an airport, or if you ever go to a rock concert or any other really loud place, or maybe you just want to go mow the lawn, right? Those sounds, they might not seem painful, they might not seem too loud, but those sounds are progressively, gradually damaging your ability to hear. So just take precaution, wear earmuffs. That's enough about hearing. Let's talk about smell, or the more technical term is olfaction. Compared to hearing, we know a lot about smell. We have one really good theory that seems to explain how smell works. It's called the lock and key theory. So the whole idea here is that your nostrils have all these little smell receptors. Those would basically be a bunch of, you could think of them as different kinds of locks. And the chemicals that you inhale, these odors, they're also shaped in very unique ways, and those would be the keys. So depending on which chemical binds with which receptor, you'll have these different kinds of smell sensations. And every smell that you've ever had is just a combination of these different locks and keys being activated. It is possible to lose your sense of smell. That would be called dysosmia. But here's how that anatomy looks. So if you look deep inside the nostril, much further than you'd be able to reach with your finger. If you look deep inside the nostril, you'll see what's called the olfactory epithelium. It's about a 1-inch square of patches on the top of each nasal cavity that contains these little tiny hairs that are the transducers of smell. Now, those those tiny little smell transducers, they actually have only a tiny little bit to travel. They have these tiny little projections into the skull where they connect with the brain. So your sense of smell takes only a very short trip to the brain. And the place that it ends up is actually very close to your memory center. And that's why, your sense of smell seems to be related to memory in many ways. If you've ever smelled something and that brought back some old memories, that's because smell and memory are kind of connected. Taste is similar to smell in some ways. The technical term for taste is gustation. And you have 4 basic taste sensations: salt, sweet, sour, and bitter. Now, we're most sensitive to bitter tastes, less to sour, less to salt, and we're least sensitive to sweet tastes. And the way we taste everything is by, our taste transducers being stimulated, and all of these are found on your taste buds. So taste buds are these, if you look very closely at your tongue, you'll see little round, like kind of fat discs scattered all over your tongue. These are your taste buds, and the transducers are on the sides of the taste bud. So what happens when you eat stuff, what happens when you taste things, is the chemicals, they get trapped in between your little papillae, is what they're called. And once they get trapped down there, they start to bind with these receptors, and then you start to taste whatever it is you're eating. Now, on your tongue, your taste buds aren't distributed evenly. You have different regions of the tongue that are most sensitive to certain kinds of tastes. So like the tip of your tongue is most sensitive to sweet tastes. The sides of your tongue and the front are most sensitive to salty, and the back on the sides is most sensitive to sour, and just on the very back, where your throat is, that's where it's going to be most sensitive to bitter. There's obviously more than 4 kinds of tastes that you can have. And the way you have all these complex different tastes is that it's not just your tongue that's involved. It's not just your mouth, it's also your nose. So whenever you eat anything, it's actually, the chemicals from that food are actually getting sucked up through what's called the retronasal pathway. Your nose and your mouth connect. So when you eat it, you're actually simultaneously smelling it. And that's why if you have a stuffy nose, if your nose is all plugged up, that's why things don't taste so interesting, because you can't get the chemicals up there to bind with your olfactory receptors. But there's a few other tastes that I wanted to mention, like savory. Savory, you could consider savory or umami to be like your 5th kind of taste sensation. There's researchers recently found evidence that we do have this kind of 5th type of taste in our mouth, and it's like a meaty or a brothy kind of a taste. And I have bad news for you if you like spicy food. I really like spicy food, but technically spiciness is not a taste. There's no such thing as a spiciness taste receptor. What you're actually tasting when you taste spicy food is the direct stimulation of your pain receptors. You're tasting pain. The thing that makes spicy food spicy, the capsaicin, that directly activates pain receptors. So if you like spicy food, you like pain. Just like smell, and just like all the other senses, people can be more or less sensitive. So individuals vary widely in their capacity for experiencing different kinds of taste sensations. You would be considered a non-taster if you lack the ability to taste certain kinds of sweet and bitter compounds. And we would consider you a super taster if not only can you identify and discriminate between many different compounds, but they also taste a lot more interesting. These tastes are much more intensive. Touch is another sense I wanted to talk about. Whenever we're talking about touch, we're generally talking about all the different skin senses. So you have many different skin senses. You have receptors for things like just feeling like something's touching you, feeling pressure, feeling pleasure and pain, feeling texture, feeling warmth, and so on. And when you look at the skin, you'll see that these receptors are definitely not evenly distributed. Some parts of your skin are far more sensitive than others. In general, for pretty much everybody, their hands are the most sensitive parts of their body. The second most sensitive part would be like the lips, the tongue, and most of the face. The least sensitive parts of the body would be things like, your arms, your legs, your feet, even your genitals. And that seems a little counterintuitive. I mean, clearly genitals should have a lot of sensory receptors because they can produce so much pleasure or so much pain when stimulated. Well, the basic explanation I have for that is the sensation of intense pleasure or intense pain, that's not at all the same thing as being sensitive. So here's a way you can test it. Like I said, your hand is one of the most sensitive parts of your body, so if you just lightly rub something on the palm of your hand, you'll realize that you're getting tons and tons of information. Like you could feel the tiniest little movement. But when you try to do that on your arm, not so much. So that's just a really easy way to test how sensitive the different parts of your body are. Pain, I mentioned pain is a skin sense, and you have two kinds of pain. There's the warning system pain, which is carried by large nerve fibers. The whole point of this warning system pain is to, tell you something bad is happening. We are being attacked. Do something about this immediately. So it's like a sharp, bright, fast pain. And after you deal with that kind of pain, then the warning system pain will fade away and you'll experience what's called reminding system pain. This is a more slow, nagging, aching kind of pain that's carried by small nerve fibers. It's much more widespread, and the whole point of it seems to be to just tell you we had damage in this area. You should try to avoid getting hit in this area again. Pain, like all your other senses, is largely modifiable. Remember, perception is creative. So you can amplify all of your perceptions, including pain, by, thinking about it differently. For example, we know that fear or high levels of anxiety tend to amplify the pain that you're feeling. Also, if you have the ability to regulate a painful stimulus, you can control it. Another way you could deal with pain is through distraction. So distracting yourself, not worrying about the pain that's about to occur, looking at something else or thinking about something else can help to reduce that pain. Because if your brain's busy processing some other information, it won't have enough resources to process this pain. And then finally, the interpretation you give to this painful stimulus can also greatly modify how painful it is. So this is where we get things like masochism. Masochists are individuals who interpret certain kinds of painful stimuli as pleasure. Now, I mentioned that you have more than just the five senses. In fact, depending on who you talk to, they'll argue that you have anywhere from 7 to 14 or even more senses. It just depends on how you consider the senses. But I would say you at least have 7. So your sixth sense has nothing to do with talking to ghosts. Your sixth sense is what I would call the kinesthetic sense. This kinesthetic sense provides information about the position of your body parts in relation to each other. So if I close my eyes and I put my arms like this, I know exactly what position my arms are in without having to look at it. Like I can just feel the position that my arms are in. And the transducers for this kinesthetic sense exist in the joints and the ligaments and the muscles. So it's the feelings I'm getting from my muscles and joints that are telling me what position my body's in. And that's clearly very different from all those skin senses we were just talking about. And then what I would consider to be the seventh sense would be your vestibular sense. It's pretty similar to the kinesthetic, but now instead of being in the muscles and the joints, now it's actually right next to the cochlea. So if you look closely at the anatomy of the cochlea, you'll see a bunch of little tubes next to it. Those are called semicircular canals, and they're filled with fluids. So those fluids move about inside the canals whenever you move about in space. So if you start rotating like this, and you start spinning around really fast, the fluid in your semicircular canals are going to start spinning as well, and that's just another way that we get information about how we're moving. Now the problem with spinning around and around and around too much is that can produce a vestibular problem. So to put it more simply, it can make you dizzy. So dizziness, motion sickness, and vertigo, these are all problems that arise from like a miscommunication between our vestibular sense and our other senses. So if you have a lot of trouble, if you get car sick or if you get seasick, that's simply because your vestibular sense isn't really corresponding very well with your other senses, and you're having trouble dealing with that lack of correspondence.